January 1943. Solomon Islands night presses down on the jungle like damp cloth. Along a low ridge overlooking the coast, Japanese officers watch the shoreline through field glasses, their silhouettes still, disciplined, certain. They expect confusion. They expect the familiar signs of an enemy landing misplaced equipment, delayed artillery, men waiting for orders that arrive too late. Instead, the beach moves with rhythm. Landing craft arrive not in bursts, but in sequence. Trucks roll forward within minutes. Crates are unloaded, stacked, moved inland. Fuel drums follow ammunition. Engineers appear almost immediately, carving roads where there were none the day before. By dawn, artillery is already registered. Rations are being distributed. Radios hum without interruption. This is not improvisation. This is routine. One officer lowers his binoculars and says nothing. Another quietly notes the time in a field notebook. What they are seeing does not match their briefings or their assumptions. American soldiers were supposed to be tactically clumsy, dependent on comfort, slow to adapt once supply lines stretched across the ocean. Yet here, thousands of miles from the American mainland, the machine does not stall. As the sun rises over the Pacific, a realization begins to form: this war will not be decided by bravery alone, but by something colder, heavier, and far more difficult to stop. The war before the shock. By the time Japanese officers stood on those ridgelines in early 1943, the war in the Pacific had already passed through its opening act. The shock of December 1941 had reshaped the balance of power in a matter of weeks. Pearl Harbor burned, Wake Island fell, Hong Kong, Guam, and the Philippines followed. Across Southeast Asia, Japanese forces advanced with speed that seemed to confirm every assumption held by Tokyo's planners. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had trained for this kind of war. Their doctrine prized initiative, offensive spirit, and rapid movement. Logistics, by comparison, were treated as a secondary concern, necessary, but expected to follow victory rather than enable it. Japanese campaigns in China and Southeast Asia reinforced this belief. Short supply lines, captured enemy stores, and reliance on local resources had carried operations forward for years. This approach shaped Japanese expectations of their enemy. American forces, in Japanese assessments, were materially rich but operationally brittle. Intelligence summaries described U.S. troops as reliant on heavy equipment, dependent on comfort, and slow to recover from disruption. Distance, Japanese officers believed, would amplify these weaknesses. The Pacific Ocean itself, vast, empty, and unforgiving, was expected to be Japan's greatest ally. In 1941 and early 1942, this assumption appeared correct. American units in the Philippines fought bravely, but were isolated. Supplies ran low. Reinforcements never arrived. Bataan and Corregidor became symbols not of American weakness, but of logistical impossibility. For Japanese commanders, the lesson was clear: cut the supply lines, and the enemy would collapse on his own. The early months of 1942 only deepened this confidence. Japanese naval power dominated the Western Pacific. Carrier strikes reached as far as the Indian Ocean. Allied bases fell faster than they could be reinforced. The concept of a decisive, battle-won climactic naval engagement that would shatter American will remained central to Japanese strategic thinking. What Japanese planners did not fully grasp was the scale of the system awakening. Behind the scenes, while Japan expanded outward, the United States turned inward toward factories, shipyards, railways, and training camps. Mobilization orders rippled through an industrial economy unlike any the world had seen. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts began launching vessels at unprecedented rates. Cargo ships, oilers, transports, and repair tenders rolled off the ways in numbers that defied pre-war projections. This was not merely production, it was organization. The US military, drawing lessons from World War I and decades of naval planning, placed logistics at the center of operational design. War Plans Orange had already considered the challenge of fighting across the Pacific. The solution was not speed alone, but endurance, the ability to move men, fuel, ammunition, and food across thousands of miles, and sustain them indefinitely, yet from Tokyo. Much of this remained invisible. Japanese intelligence underestimated the speed of American recovery per Pearl Harbor. Industrial statistics were misread. Production goals were assumed to be aspirational rather than achievable. The American tendency towards standardization, identical vehicles, interchangeable parts, uniform procedures was seen as inflexibility, not strength. As 1940 progressed, the first cracks in Japan's assumptions appeared. The Battle of the Coral Sea halted expansion. Midway destroyed four fleet carriers. But even then, many Japanese officers believed these were temporary setbacks. They still expected the Americans to overextend themselves, to stumble once operations moved far from major bases. Guadalcanal would test that belief. When US Marines landed there in August 1942, Japanese planners anticipated a familiar pattern. Initial aggression followed by logistical strain. They expected shortages, disorganization, and eventual withdrawal. Instead, month after month, American forces remained. Supplies continued to arrive. Airfields were repaired under fire. Losses were replaced. By the end of the campaign, the uncomfortable truth was emerging, but not yet fully understood, because behind every American soldier on that island stood something. Japanese officers had not planned to fight. A system. And it was only beginning to show its full weight. The system behind the shore. What Japanese officers saw on Pacific beaches in 1942 and 1943 was not improvisation under pressure. It was the outward expression of a system that had been designed long before the first landing craft touched coral sand. American logistics in the Pacific did not begin with the war. They began in classrooms, war colleges, and planning offices decades earlier. US naval strategists had studied distance as a problem to be solved, not avoided. The Pacific was measured not in courage, but in tonnage, fuel consumption, turnaround time, and repair capacity. Every mile was calculated, every assumption tested. When war came, that planning found its moment. The United States did not rely on captured resources. It created mobile infrastructure. Floating dry docks followed the fleet. Repair ships replaced damaged hulls without returning them to the mainland. Oilers refueled task forces at sea, extending operational range beyond what Japanese planners believed possible. A ship no longer needed a port, it needed a rendezvous point and a timetable. On land, the same logic applied. Engineer units arrived with the first waves. Seabees naval construction battalions were trained to build under fire. Airstrips rose from jungle clearings in days, not weeks. Roads appeared where maps showed nothing. Warehouses formed behind the lines, stocked not for the next battle, but for the next month. This was sustained warfare. American doctrine assumed high consumption. Ammunition expenditure was calculated generously. Fuel was shipped in quantities that appeared excessive to Japanese observers. Rations were standardized, packaged, and delivered with regularity. Even mail was prioritized, moving across the Pacific as part of the same logistical flow as bombs and spare parts. To Japanese officers, raised in a culture of austerity and endurance, this abundance seemed wasteful. But waste, in the American system, was a form of insurance. Shortages were unacceptable. Delays were treated as failures of planning, not inevitable conditions of war. The contrast with Japanese logistics was stark. Japan's industrial base, though sophisticated, was limited by geography and resources. Oil had to be imported. Shipping was vulnerable. Merchant fleets were finite. Army and Navy logistics often competed rather than cooperated. Supply doctrine assumed short, decisive campaigns, not prolonged attrition across thousands of miles. As American submarines began to sink Japanese cargo vessels in increasing numbers, these weaknesses grew harder to hide. Supplies reached forward units late or not at all. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized ships. Soldiers learned to fight with what they carried, not what could be replaced. Japanese officers, watching American operations, began to notice a pattern. Units rotated out of the line before collapse. Equipment losses were replaced with identical models. Wounded men were evacuated quickly, treated, and often returned to duty. Even after setbacks, American formations regained strength with unsettling speed. Reports began to circulate up the chain of command. They described an enemy who did not exhaust himself, an enemy whose mistakes were temporary, an enemy whose presence on an island did not weaken with time, but solidified. Each day brought more material, more men, more capability. By late 1943, the realization could no longer be dismissed as anecdotal. American logistics were not merely supporting operations, they were shaping them. Offensives were launched not when opportunity appeared, but when supply conditions were optimal. Battles were chosen as much for accessibility as for strategic value. Japanese officers, trained to think in terms of decisive moments, now faced an adversary who thought in terms of processes. And processes do not panic. They do not tire. They do not run out of momentum easily. As the war pressed deeper into the Central Pacific, expectation collided with reality again and again, each time with greater force, because soon, logistics would stop being a background detail. And become the deciding weapon. The human view, watching the machine. For Japanese officers on the front lines, the American logistical system was first encountered not in charts or intelligence briefings, but through daily observation. It revealed itself in routines, in repetition, in the unsettling normality of abundance under fire. Diaries and after-action reports from Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later the Gilberts describe a similar experience. American units did not appear desperate. Even when under pressure, food arrived on schedule. Ammunition dumps were replenished. Medical evacuation continued regardless of weather or losses. These were not isolated successes. They were consistent patterns. To men trained in the ethic of endurance. This consistency was disorienting. Japanese soldiers were conditioned to accept hunger, to fight on reduced rations, to conserve ammunition as a matter of survival. Watching an enemy fire freely, confident that supply would follow, created a psychological imbalance. It suggested not recklessness, but certainty. Japanese officers noted that American troops rotated more frequently. Frontline fatigue was managed rather than endured. Units were withdrawn, refitted, and returned to action with restored strength. This preservation of manpower contrasted sharply with Japanese doctrine, which emphasized holding ground at all costs. The result was quiet admiration mixed with unease. The Americans did not seem tougher as individuals, but they were protected by something larger than individual resilience. A system that absorbed strain without visible fracture. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The tactical reality. Fighting as supplied in EMI on the tactical level. Logistics reshaped the battlefield in ways Japanese planners had not anticipated. American forces could maintain pressure without pause. Artillery barrages were sustained. Air support remained available day after day. Defensive positions, once located, could be systematically reduced. Japanese counterattacks often relied on surprise and timing. But against an enemy with uninterrupted communications and resupply, surprise lost its impact quickly. Even when Americans were caught off guard, recovery was rapid. Losses were replaced. Positions were reinforced overnight. This forced Japanese units into reactive postures. Ammunition shortages limited options. Artillery, once expended, fell silent. Aircraft sorties were curtailed by fuel constraints. Tactical creativity could not compensate indefinitely for material absence. American logistics also allowed for experimentation. New tactics were tested, revised, and reapplied with adjustments. Failures did not end operations. They informed the next attempt. The battlefield became a laboratory sustained by supplied. Japanese officers recognized this as a fundamental shift. They were no longer fighting an enemy who could be exhausted through persistence. They were fighting an enemy whose entrance was artificially extended, manufactured, shipped, and delivered on schedule. The technological flow, standardization as strength technology, in this context, was not defined by superior weapons alone, but by standardization. American equipment looked the same from island to island. Vehicles shared parts, radios operated on familiar systems, training manuals produced uniform behavior across units that had never fought together before. This homogeneity confused Japanese assessments. Destroying one American unit did not degrade the next. Captured equipment yielded no unique advantage. There were no irreplaceable tools to target, no fragile link to sever. Supply ships delivered not just arms, but predictability. Repair crews knew exactly what they would encounter. Replacement parts fit without modification. Damage was temporary, not decisive, for Japanese officers accustomed to adapting equipment in the field and compensating for shortages with ingenuity. This mechanical reliability felt inhuman. It removed uncertainty from American operations and placed it entirely on the opposing side. And as the war continued, that imbalance only widened, because the next angles would reveal that logistics did not just support American warfare, it reshaped leadership decisions, enemy perceptions, and the moral weight of the conflict itself. Leadership. When assumptions failed at higher levels of command, American logistics forced Japanese leaders into a painful reassessment. Operational plans built on attrition and isolation no longer produced expected results. Islands that should have withered instead hardened into fortified bases. Campaign timelines stretched beyond projections, consuming men and material Japan could not replace. Staff officers reported that American operations followed schedules rather than impulses. Landings occurred when supply conditions were met, not when opportunity seemed fleeting. If conditions were not favorable, attacks were delayed without panic. This patience backed by material depth contradicted Japanese leadership culture, which prized decisive action and moral force. Admirals and generals began to understand that they were not fighting individual commanders making bold choices, but an institution that absorbed loss without changing direction. Orders from Tokyo increasingly reflected defensive thinking, emphasizing conservation of strength, yet the means to conserve were no longer available. Leadership confidence eroded quietly, not through dramatic defeat, but through repetition. Each time Americans returned stronger than before. The enemy seen clearly. American doctrine revealed from the Japanese perspective. The American approach to war gradually became legible. Logistics were not an afterthought, they were doctrine. American manuals treated supply as a command responsibility. Logistics officers held authority equal to combat commanders. Decisions flowed from capacity, not hope. This produced a form of warfare that appeared cautious, even slow, but proved relentless. Japanese intelligence reports began to note that American offensives did not seek annihilation. They sought sustainability. The goal was not a decisive battle, but permanent presence. Once established, American forces did not retreat. They accumulated. This reframed the conflict. Victory could no longer be defined as enemy withdrawal. It had to mean enemy destruction, a far more difficult objective against an opponent who controlled the flow of replacement. The enemy, once expected to break under pressure, now appeared methodical and unyielding. Moral and psychological weight. Fighting time itself. Greatest impact of American logistics may have been psychological. Japanese soldiers spoke of fighting not men, but time. Every delay favored the Americans. Every day without decisive victory allowed more ships, more planes, more supplies to arrive. Morale suffered not from fear, but from futility. Courage remained. Discipline held. But belief in eventual success began to thin. The enemy did not seem to bleed in proportion to the damage inflicted. This realization spread unevenly, but inexorably. It reached from frontline trenches to staff headquarters. It was not shouted. It was written quietly in reports and personal letters. And as this understanding deepened, the war moved toward moments where logistics would no longer merely influence outcomes. They would decide them. When supply became Destiny B mid-1944, the balance in the Pacific had shifted beyond recovery, though the full weight of that shift was not yet visible to every participant. To Japanese officers who had been watching American operations since Guadalcanal, however, the pattern was unmistakable. Logistics was no longer an advantage. It was the battlefield itself. The Central Pacific Campaign revealed this truth with brutal clarity. To Guadalcanal, in January 1944, American forces struck deep into territory once thought insulated by distance. The operation was not rushed. It was rehearsed. Weeks before the first landing, naval gunfire softened defenses with precision informed by aerial reconnaissance. Carrier aircraft flew thousands of sorties, sustained by a fleet that refueled at sea as if distance had ceased to matter. Japanese defenders expected the usual signs of strain. They waited for pauses. None came. Supplies continued to flow. Damaged ships withdrew briefly, then returned repaired. Air support never fully disappeared. Even weather disruptions failed to halt operations for long. The tempo remained controlled, relentless, immune to improvisation. Then came the Marianas. The invasion of Saipan in June 1944 marked a turning point, not just strategically, but psychologically. Japanese officers understood the stakes. Loss of the Marianas would expose the home islands to direct air attack. Every effort was made to contest the landings, yet the same pattern repeated amplified. American forces landed with overwhelming material superiority, but more importantly, with depth. Ammunition expenditure was heavy and unrestrained. Casualties were replaced almost immediately. When resistance stiffened, reinforcements arrived not as emergency measures, but as scheduled deliveries. Japanese counterattacks, fierce and disciplined, collided with prepared positions that had been resupplied overnight. Even when American units suffered setbacks, their ability to regroup and return in force remained intact. At sea, the Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the logistical divide in stark terms. Japanese carrier air power, limited by pilot losses and fuel shortages, could not sustain operations. American carriers, supported by an intricate web of tankers and supply ships, maintained continuous air presence. Japanese pilots flew, replacements were scarce. American pilots flew knowing another squadron waited behind them. The outcome became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but for Japanese officers, the name concealed a deeper truth. This was not merely a battle lost, it was a system failing against another system that could not be exhausted. Reports from the front spoke of an enemy who could pause, adjust, and resume without losing coherence. The Americans could afford delay. Japan could not, and still, the final understanding had not yet fully settled, because the realization was not sealed by one battle, but by repetition, each operation confirming what the last had suggested. As the Americans prepared for the next advance, Japanese commanders faced a future where bravery no longer bridged the gap between intention and outcome. And the decisive proof was still approaching. The moment expectation collapseth. Collapse of expectation did not arrive with a single order or announcement. It arrived through paperwork, through logistics reports, operational summaries, and casualty returns that no longer aligned with hope. By late 1944, Japanese officers studying the situation in the Philippines confronted numbers that told an unforgiving story. American landings at Leyte in October were not probing attacks. They were sustained invasions, supported by a logistical architecture that dwarfed anything previously encountered. Hundreds of ships moved in coordination. Supplies were delivered continuously, not in waves, but in streams. Japanese planners had expected congestion. They expected confusion as American forces attempted to operate across vast distances and hostile waters. Instead, unloading schedules were maintained under air attack. Temporary harbors were constructed. Damaged vessels were removed and replaced without disrupting the flow. For Japanese commanders, Leyte revealed a decisive asymmetry. Even successful attacks inflicted damage that was rapidly repaired or replaced. Losses failed to accumulate on the American side in ways that altered operational capability. On the Japanese side, every loss was permanent. The Battle of Leyte Gulf underscored this reality. Japanese naval forces committed nearly everything remaining in a final attempt to disrupt the invasion. Fuel shortages limited maneuver. Training deficits weakened execution. American task forces, supplied and reinforced at sea, absorbed the effort and continued operating. Afterward, Japanese reports increasingly avoided predictions of victory. Language shifted. Phrases emphasizing delay, attrition, and honorable resistance replaced expectations of decisive success. This was not defeatism, it was recognition. On land, the pattern repeated. American forces expanded their beachheads regardless of Japanese resistance. Artillery ammunition was expended in volumes that Japanese logisticians could not comprehend. Airfields captured one week were operational the next. Engineers worked continuously, supported by a flow of material that seemed inexhaustible. By the time operations moved toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the lesson was fully absorbed among those who could see it clearly. The Americans were not winning because they fought better. They were winning because they could continue fighting indefinitely. Japanese officers wrote of an enemy who did not need to gamble. Every move was backed by supply, every setback absorbed. The war had become unequal, not in courage, but in capacity. Expectation - the belief that American forces would falter under strain was gone. In its place stood certainty of a different kind, that unless the system itself could be destroyed, no battlefield success would be enough. And with that understanding, the war entered its final, irreversible phase. Consequences that could not be reversed. The reality of American logistical dominance was fully understood. Its consequences unfolded with a slow, crushing inevitability. For Japanese forces across the Pacific, the problem was no longer how to win, but how long resistance could be maintained under conditions that worsened with every passing month. Supply shortages became the defining feature of Japanese operations. Ammunition was conserved to the point of paralysis. Artillery units fired sparingly, saving shells for moments that rarely changed outcomes. Fuel constraints grounded aircraft and immobilized ships long before they encountered the enemy. Even food, once taken for granted in earlier campaigns, became scarce. In contrast, American forces expanded their operational reach with confidence. The island hopping strategy was not merely tactical, it was logistical. Islands were selected not only for strategic value, but for their ability to support airfields, anchorages, and supply depots. Once taken, they became nodes in an expanding network. Japanese garrisons left behind on bypassed islands were rendered irrelevant. Cut off from resupply, they fought on in isolation, but their presence no longer influenced the course of the war. This was a new form of defeat, one in which soldiers remained alive, armed, and determined, yet strategically meaningless. Operational reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reflected this shift. Japanese commanders acknowledged that even successful local actions failed to alter broader trends. The Americans replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. Equipment destroyed one week reappeared the next, unchanged. Morale suffered not from lack of discipline, but from clarity. Officers understood the mathematics of war now worked against them. Industrial capacity, shipping tonnage, fuel reserves, these were not abstractions. They were decisive factors that no amount of courage could overcome. American logistics also reshaped the rhythm of combat. Offensives followed predictable cycles of build-up, assault, consolidation, and expansion. There were no long pauses for recovery, no desperate stretches of inactivity caused by shortage. The pressure was constant, methodical, and unrelenting. For Japanese leadership, this forced strategic contraction. Plans focused on defending the approaches to the home islands. Resources were concentrated where possible, but concentration only magnified scarcity elsewhere. Every choice involved sacrifice. By the time American forces prepared for the final battles, the outcome was no longer in doubt among those who studied the flow of supply. What remained was the human cost of accepting that reality, and the deeper consequences were still unfolding. Living inside the imbalance as 1945 approached, the imbalance created by American logistics shaped every remaining decision Japan made. The war narrowed geographically, but intensified psychologically. Japanese commanders no longer planned for victory in a conventional sense. They planned for endurance, delay, and the infliction of cost, hoping that suffering might achieve what strategy could not. Yet even this approach was constrained by supply. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese defenders constructed elaborate defensive systems designed to minimize ammunition expenditure and maximize time. Underground networks replaced mobile warfare. Fire was withheld until targets were certain. Every round mattered. American forces responded not with hesitation, but with accumulation. Battles were preceded by prolonged bombardment, sustained without concern for scarcity. When resistance persisted, more artillery was brought forward, more aircraft flew missions, more ships arrived offshore, rotating crews, refueling, rearming. Japanese officers observing these battles recognized the final expression of what they had seen since Guadalcanal. The American war effort no longer surged, it flowed. Losses were absorbed as part of an expected rhythm. Units were relieved, replenished, and returned. The machine did not accelerate or slow. It advanced. Strategically, Japan's options vanished. Industrial output declined under bombing. Shipping losses severed remaining supply lines. Even internal distribution became unreliable. The logistical system that had sustained Japan's early victories could no longer sustain basic defense. American commanders, by contrast, planned beyond immediate battles. Preparations for operations against the home islands included stockpiling months of supplies in advance. Hospitals were expanded. Replacement pools grew. Everything pointed forward. Japanese reports from this period often avoided dramatic language. They did not exaggerate American strength. They simply described it. Tonnage landed. Sorties flown. Ammunition expended. The numbers told the story without commentary. For many officers, the realization was sobering rather than shocking. They had watched it develop over years. What began as disbelief had become certainty. The Americans had not solved war. They had industrialized it. And in doing so, they had transformed logistics from a supporting function into the central force of decision. As the fighting neared its end, this understanding lingered quiet, heavy, inescapable, leaving only the question of what it all meant. The quiet weapon long after the last shots were fired in the Pacific. Japanese officers reflected on what they had witnessed with a clarity shaped by distance and loss. The Americans, they concluded, had not defeated Japan through brilliance of maneuver or superiority of spirit. They had done something far more consequential. They had made war predictable. In the Pacific, courage remained constant on all sides. Discipline did not disappear. Sacrifice did not diminish. What changed was the environment in which those human qualities operated. The American system reduced uncertainty. It ensured that decisions were not gambles, but calculations supported by material certainty. Logistics did not inspire speeches. It did not charge hills. It did not appear in heroic photographs. Yet it governed every outcome. It determined how long a unit could fight, how quickly it could recover, and whether loss became temporary or permanent. For Japanese officers raised in a tradition that valued decisive moments and moral force, this realization was unsettling. It suggested that modern war was no longer shaped primarily by individual will, but by structures that extended beyond the battlefield. Factories, ports, schedules, and supply chains. The Pacific War revealed a truth that would echo through later conflicts. Victory belongs not only to those who fight bravely, but to those who can sustain effort without interruption, to those who can replace what is lost, to those who can continue when others must stop. On distant islands, Under unfamiliar stars, Japanese officers had expected chaos from their enemy. What they encountered instead was order. And in that order, they glimpsed the future of warfare where the quiet movement of ships and supplies could decide the fate of nations, long before the final battle was fought.